One of the more charming myths about counselors is that we are unbiased. I've had clients say the sweetest things to me, like that they are grateful to me for being so unbiased, or new couples will come in and say that they've been looking to work with somebody who won't be biased. And it's sweet because it's a naive belief that there's somebody out there that's not biased. And I tell them as much, and that if they can show me a human being that's not biased, I'll show them a human being who's in a coma. And even they probably have biases. It's just not possible to not have biases. You're going to have them, and as a counselor, you actually need them. The most important thing that you can do with your biases is use them, because you have biases like a belief that there are certain kinds of change that are valuable for human beings to pursue. And there are certain ways to produce those kinds of change. You have beliefs, and those beliefs bias you. They color what you see, and they determine what you think is important to do. You may also have the experience of, while you're working with somebody, having a sense inside yourself that something's wrong for somebody, or that there's something that needs attention. Because one of the greatest sources of information you can rely on as a counselor is this kind of sense inside yourself about what's needed. And that forms a kind of bias. It tips you in a particular direction as opposed to a different direction. So you need your biases, and you've got to use them. Of course, what people really mean and what they really want when they say that they want somebody unbiased is that they want me to not be run by my biases. They're glad that I don't seem to let my biases get the better of me, that I use them in an aware kind of way. So let's talk about how to do that. What are some of the kinds of biases we encounter, and what do you do with bias when you notice it arising? So an example could be that you are working with a client who complains because they're spending a lot of time taking care of a sick family member or an elder, or maybe they just devote so much time to their family that they don't know how to get some of their own needs met. And you might have this sense in yourself like, well, they've really just got to put themselves first, and maybe you'll say as much to them. But that comes from a prejudice of yours. It comes from a cultural bias, because perhaps, like me, you've grown up in a culture that is individualistic. And so you think that people's sense of self comes from putting themselves first, from their own individual accomplishments, and from pursuing their own personal desires. If someone comes from a different cultural community, they may actually have a sense of self that comes from fulfilling the kind of role that's important for them to play within their family or their community. So you can expose this particular prejudice by admitting it. You can say to your client, gosh, the more you talk about this, the more I notice I have a bias. And the bias is I keep wanting to say to you something like, you've just got to put yourself first. But I bet other people say that to you too. And I bet you even have that thought yourself already sometimes. And if you do that, that can lead to an interesting conversation. Admitting your bias will keep you from unawarely exercising it. It'll make sure that even if you do unawarely exercise it, your client knows that's what you're doing because you've already told them that you have the bias. You can't get away with it anymore. But it also exposes important assumptions that you have and perhaps that they have as well. It leads to conversation about the source of the bias and how it operates in both of you, and can help you recognize things that are at play that you wouldn't otherwise notice. Could help them, in an example like this, find the right balance between getting their own needs taken care of so that they can better serve their family, which is their highest value. Another example of a kind of a preference, I'll give you an example from my own history, a preference that I had that influenced the way I worked with a client. I worked with a woman once who was addicted to marijuana. She had been addicted to a number of things in her life and spent a lot of time being clean and sober, but she got back on weed and she tried to do it in moderation. And at the time that we were working together, she was failing to moderate. She just found herself smoking every day. She found herself smoking more than once a day, which is not what she'd wanted to do. Now, I don't smoke pot, and I have personal experience that leads me to believe that pot is kind of a growth inhibitor, that it actually stops people from being able to do the kind of work I want to be able to do with people as a counselor. So I have personal preference, personal prejudice that biases me to want to say something like, hey, you know what? You just gotta admit that you're an addict. What are you doing smoking pot? What are you doing trying to moderate? That's never gonna happen. You just gotta quit. I'll help you to do that. Otherwise, how are you gonna face your real feelings so that you can grow? So what I did in this case was I thwarted my bias. I didn't actually admit it. I didn't say anything out loud about it. I just thwarted it. Inside of myself, I said, let's try to act against that bias. And so what I did instead is I said, you know what? It seems like you want to smoke pot every day. What's wrong with that? And she told me what was wrong with it. And I said, you know, that doesn't sound so bad. And I kept representing the position that it was kind of an awesome thing for her to do. And of course, she then took on the position that she should stop. And I kept thwarting it until she was no longer representing just the part of herself that thought she should stop, but instead also looking at the part of herself that actually needed to smoke every day for good reasons. We came to something together. We came to discoveries together, like about how all her life she'd been addicted to stuff because maybe she had been trying to learn that it's okay to just chill and enjoy life and not have to be productive and not have to grow all the time. And marijuana was actually the perfect thing for her to be addicted to for this purpose because it wasn't all that destructive. And so it meant that she could smoke it every day. It didn't have that bad of an effect. And it got her to this place where she could stop thinking that her value was based on her productivity. It was actually something that she needed. And I wouldn't have learned that from her if I had used my bias to try to direct her. Thwarting my bias allowed me to learn something from my client that I could never have otherwise learned. Let me give you one more kind of example. In this case, of a sort of a theoretical bias. Attachment theory is a really popular kind of theory that goes into this sort of work that couples counselors do these days. And so if you're working with a couple, and let's say they have a classic pursuer-distancer dynamic. The woman pursues and the man distances himself. And you know from attachment theory about how there's a kind of insecure attachment at play. How if only you could help them become more bonded, have a greater sense of security in their attachment, they wouldn't need to play those roles with each other, and it would eliminate a lot of the conflict in their relationship. Well, you could bring that theoretical bias to the work that you do with them, and you'd miss some other really important things. For instance, it might be the case that they're terrible for each other and they should not be together, and you're helping them to get more bonded. Why would you want to do that, given that they're a terrible couple for each other? Maybe there's something happening that you could find out about if you just considered alternatives to your own theoretical bias. Like an alternative could be that maybe he's distancing himself from her because he knows if he doesn't, that they'll be stuck together forever, and he wants them to be. But he thinks it'll be bad for her. Maybe he's got her spiritual growth in mind and he doesn't even realize it. He's trying to free her from him so that she can grow in ways that she knows she never will if they stay together. And if you consider alternatives, you could look at the possibility that they're just not meant to be together, and there's some way that he's got her best spiritual growth interests in mind, and that gives you a very different perspective. It's not to say that that's any more right than your previous theoretical perspective. What you get is you have multiple perspectives on the world. It's like, you can see through your right eye or you can see through your left eye, and those each give you one perspective. But if you've got both at the same time, then you've got depth perception, a whole other dimension that you can see. When you've got multiple perspectives, you can see more about what's going on, more multidimensionally. And you only do this by considering alternatives to the theoretical bias that you have. There's something related that's important here, which is we've all got cognitive biases. So when you've got a theoretical bias like the attachment theory bias, you might exercise something called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias happens, we all do this, when you look for evidence that confirms your belief and you ignore or disregard evidence that's disconfirming. So maybe you help this couple bond more with each other, and it turns out they drop the pursuer role and the distancer role, and they have less conflict, and that's confirming your bias. You've got evidence. It's really they need to be more attached, and that's what works. But the whole process has allowed you to miss this other important dimension of what's going on. So there are all kinds of preferences and prejudices and theoretical biases and cognitive biases that operate in us. The point is to be more aware of the bias that you have. It allows you to do things like admit your bias, which helps you expose assumptions that are useful in the conversation that occurs in the counseling relationship. It allows you to thwart your biases so that instead of thinking you already know, you can learn from your client about what they know or about what's going on at a level that they're not aware of but that comes to the surface because you've thwarted your own bias. And you can consider alternatives, which allows you to have multiple perspectives on the world. Instead of taking away somebody's victim story, you support it and you add to it another story, an empowerment story. They become multi-storied. You've got multiple perspectives, there's more dimension, and there's more that's possible. The key factor, the key ingredient, the common denominator is awareness. Know that you have biases and have them awarely.